As the United States home front fueled the war industries at home, our soldiers simultaneously powered the war machine in North Africa and in Europe. Shortly after the December 7th Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill traveled to the White House to meet with FDR. The two met on December 22, 1941, and for 3 weeks they collaborated on a strategy for World War II. They ultimately decided that Hitler and Italy posed a greater immediate threat, and once they had a victory in Europe, they could then focus on the war in the Pacific. During this meeting, Roosevelt and Churchill developed a friendship and admiration that would last throughout their relationship. Even prior to the attack on Pearl Harbor and the formal declaration of war by the United States, German U-boats had been wreaking havoc on United States supply ships in the Atlantic. If the United States was going to sufficiently enter the fight in Europe, they were going to have to send soldiers and supplies safely across the Atlantic. The Allies responded as they had done in World War I by using convoys, large groupings of both merchant and military ships. These convoys were accompanied by planes with radar to spot out German wolf packs. By 1943, the Allies had taken out the threat of German U-boats and controlled the Atlantic. One of the war strategies that Roosevelt and Churchill devised was a way to force Hitler and the Axis powers to fight on two different fronts. Hitler had already invaded Russia and was advancing eastward, but was faced with harsh resistance from Stalin and the Soviet Army. The United States and Great Britain decided to first focus on regaining North Africa as a jumping point into Italy. The successes on both fronts would ultimately sway the tide of the war towards the Allies. The Germans had been fighting the Soviet Union since June of 1941. They had been slowed temporarily during a bitter winter in 1941, but were on the offensive again in 1942. The Soviets would ultimately stop the Axis advance at the Battle of Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad began in August of 1942, and the highly industrial city took a constant bombardment from the German Luftwaffe. Stalin refused to surrender the city that was his namesake, and told officers to defend the city at all costs. The Soviet troops held off Germans until winter arrived again with another devastating cold season. By the end of winter, the Germans were starving and poorly supplied. They surrendered in January of 1943. While the Battle of Stalingrad took place, the other Allied forces were busy regaining territory in North Africa in what was known as Operation Torch. The operation was led by Dwight D. Eisenhower. In November of 1942, a huge dispatch of Allied troops landed in Casablanca, and by May of 1943, the last of the German Afrika Korps had surrendered, and North Africa was under Allied control. Regaining control of North Africa gave the Allies a jumping point towards Italy and the Axis powers. Even before all of Africa was under Allied control, Roosevelt and Churchill had met to discuss the next steps of the Allied war effort. They decided that an attack from Britain across the English Channel towards France was ultimately going to be necessary. However, Churchill thought that an attack on Italy was a safer bet. In the summer of 1943, the Allies had captured Sicily. The army's collapse in Sicily led to Mussolini being stripped of his powers and arrested. Hitler would send German resources and troops to fight the Allies in Italy, and fighting in Italy would not slow until shortly before Germany's surrender. The Italian campaign would showcase the successes of the Tuskegee Airmen, but would also lead to many American casualties. In their most significant military offensive, the Allies launched the D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, to regain France and have a launching point into Western Europe. The invasion involved heavy casualties on both sides and was again led by Dwight D. Eisenhower. The D-Day invasion was the largest land and sea operation in history. The United States military was fortunate enough to have some of the best military leaders in the world at this time, and it aided in the Allies' success following D-Day. General Omar Bradley would unleash an air and land bombardment at St. Lo to open the way for General George S. Patton and his Third Army. Patton and his soldiers would advance through France, and by August they would reach Paris. By September of 1944, France had been liberated, as well as Belgium and Luxembourg. Shortly after this, President Roosevelt was re-elected to a fourth term as president. Hitler's last attempt to disrupt the Allied offensive was at the Battle of the Bulge. In Belgium, Hitler hoped to disrupt supply lines and separate the British and American armies. His tanks advanced or bulged 60 miles into the Allied territory. During the campaign, German SS soldiers had captured and executed 120 U.S. soldiers. The battle raged on for a month, and ultimately it would prove to be tragic for the Germans. The Germans would lose 120,000 troops, 600 tanks and guns, and 1,600 planes in the Battle of the Bulge. From this point on, the German army could do nothing but retreat. As United States troops pushed closer and closer towards Germany, they began to come across the death camps that were part of Hitler's final solution. What they saw was tragic and horrifying for many of the soldiers. The soldiers found prisoners that were barely clinging to life. These prisoners were children as well as adults, and they had experienced tragedy on a level that the world had never seen. The Allied soldiers and medical personnel would care for and help the Jewish victims of the Holocaust, and even helped bury the dead that were at the camps. Finally, with the German military machine being beaten, and following Hitler's suicide, the Allies and General Eisenhower accepted the unconditional surrender of the Third Reich on May 8, 1945. This day would be known as VE Day, or Victory in Europe Day, and was celebrated across the country. Sadly, Franklin Delano Roosevelt would not be there to see VE Day. The month prior to the German surrender, FDR had a stroke while posing for a portrait and died. His death was mourned by Americans across the country, as well as by people in other parts of the world. FDR had been elected president 4 times and had been the face of our nation during the Great Depression as well as during World War II. He had a successful presidency, but one that also contained the black mark of Japanese internment. Roosevelt's death would be mourned heavily by his longtime friend Winston Churchill, who had a tremendous amount of respect and admiration for the fellow leader. The relationship that these two had with one another and the teamwork they displayed helped to ensure that Europe and the world was free of the oppression of the Axis powers. With the passing of FDR, Vice President Harry S. Truman would become the 33rd President of the United States and our Commander-in-Chief for the rest of World War II.